Tom, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on, mate.
Hi Andy, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Just to begin with, just so that anyone that's listening that hasn't yet come across you, if there is anybody, would you be able to walk us through your career background and just give us the context that brings us to today?
Yeah, sure. I'm a failed wannabe professional rugby player that basically was trying to do the next best thing, hang around in the back of photos if teams did well by being a part of the sports staff. So I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I've just finished with England Rugby, and I was working for them for 10 years in various senior roles with England men's team in strength and conditioning roles. So I coordinated, I headed up, and I had senior roles there, supporting roles, and that started in 2014. Prior to that, I was in working in Super Rugby with the New South Wales Waratahs as a senior strength and conditioning coach. So that was the last 15 years approximately, and prior to that, I was a professional rugby player playing semi-pro in England and Australia, while playing in international rugby sevens myself on the circuit for approximately 2008 2009. And then prior to that, I was studying. I did my undergraduate at Loughborough, postgraduate at Oxford, all while basically starting the coaching journey from about 18 years old when I was at Loughborough, just volunteering, but also playing as seriously as I could. I was spinning plates, coaching and playing until I had a pretty bad neck injury in 2009, which coincided with an opportunity to commit to my career full time with the Waratahs in 2009. And from then on, I've been a career coach.
How much has being a sort of former player yourself helped you in roles? Is it something I'm sure you don't go up to England rugby players and say, I used to play it myself, but does it come across to them your game knowledge and your kind of appreciation for the game, maybe beyond somebody that hasn't, do you think?
Yeah, they would be thoroughly unimpressed. Somebody you've got nearly 100, you've got 100 caps. I think, yeah, perhaps so. Yeah, although I don't see any lack of respect for the guys that don't haven't played rugby.
Yeah.
But I think you can have a good rugby conversation with them, and I think perhaps with a sport like sevens, having played sevens internationally, and you're asking them to work really hard, I'd like to think that they understand that I knew what that was like myself,
Yeah.
because you've got to be fit and you've got to go through a bit of suffering to build up your capacity in a sport like that. So I think every year that goes by that I'm further away from having done it, they probably care less, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm aware it's a really cliche question and a really cliche assumption that you always assume the former players better connect with current players when they're in coaching roles, but it can only be an advantage, I think.
Yeah, I think they probably see me as the rugby guy as opposed to, I work with the staff, staff that were from other sports and they were the football guy or the the horse riding person. Like, yeah, I suppose they probably feel like you're one of them, I'd say.
Yeah. I'm aware you've got, for an S&C coach, quite a strong interest in rehab. What shaped that interest kind of over your career? What kind of led you that into that path?
Well, certainly in my last role, you had so little opportunities to develop, and really push performance because you were playing so frequently. Certainly international campaigns, you're never more than 10 days away from a test match.
Yeah.
Apart from the once in 4 years opportunities, you had to do a genuine pre-season with the players prior to a World Cup. So the times then when myself and the medical team were managing like a short to medium term return to play scheme, which was a format where players close to playing for us, they at least have an opportunity to play in that campaign that you've got access with them to. They were the times when you thought, well, this is when I can make a real difference here. Apart from just the your support of the team in general, getting to the test match and feeling good, you can chip away at some performance puzzles here with the rehab. It's a great opportunity, and my latest role with a football team it was just another example of, well, this is it's such a great opportunity to add value here because you can give someone something they don't have. You can get to the bottom of something that might have been niggling on them for a long, long time. You can help them regain confidence in their bodies. You can do a bit, you can do deeper level of diagnostics and troubleshooting on maybe some movement complications that have just been underdiagnosed or unresolved. So it's just a really good opportunity. It's a I always say it to the people that got hurt. This is, I know it sucks, but it's a hell of an opportunity as well. There's a silver lining here if you look at it the right way.
I can imagine when you're sort of outside of, tournament blocks and you're in the sort of, I don't know what you call that, like the regular season for you or the regular sort of longer time spans between tournaments. I'm sure there's a sort of lot of coordination and liaising with coaches and players and what they're doing at their own clubs. Do you find that becomes like a hotbed for your development because you're always plugging into other coaches, other physios, and sort of other approaches essentially?
Yeah, the fortunate thing now is you're exposed to 12 other programs in the Premiership clubs, and they obviously all do good jobs, great jobs, and they've all got different opinions, and they're all going to have different educations. They're going to have staff that have come from AFL, have come from European soccer even. So they're quite diverse background quite often, or they might just be really, really skilled in sort of the UK education scheme. So you're absolutely right. Like when you get the program from the player that's come from the club, oh, look at that, I wonder why they do that. And the good relationships you have with those coaches can be really, really mutually beneficial. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
When we connected before, it was really apparent that you've got a big interest in sort of problem solving movement, or maybe diagnosing like chronic non-traumatic injuries or issues with players.
Yeah.
Um, Without kind of mentioning maybe player names and things like that, is there any kind of interesting cases that maybe exemplify how your approach works in terms of looking at athletes to diagnose the problem from a coach perspective?
Yeah, yeah. I've got a host of ones really. I mean, the ones that I'm really intrigued at the moment are like tendinopathies are a bit of a hot topic, aren't they? I remember when I played, I didn't know the word tendinopathy. I heard of tendinitis, but no one had it. And I don't know for what reason that's the case now, but no one had it. Now everyone's bloody got one, haven't they? And uh, and I'm generalizing here. Our first protocol is to bring the people out of pain. Is bringing the athlete out of pain. So you go through all the tendon loading strategies, don't you? And that gets you to a point. And in many situations, that's very successful and job done, and you crack on. But in a lot of the other situations, that doesn't work. It's not effective enough. You go on this cycle of loading tendons isometrically for ages, and it just goes on and on. And I didn't load my tendon that day. That's why it's sore. And I've always thought to myself, because I tore my patellar tendon a couple 3 or 4 years ago. So then I just started experimenting with myself. My question's always been to myself, why have they torn that tendon and not the other one? Why is it not a bilateral tendon? What was it about that side of the body in that moment that meant that that tendon went and not another one? It might have just been the action was extreme, and that's happened before. Like you see the Achilles ruptures where they have a really extreme landing mechanics, and it's just really unfortunate the way the body was displaced in that microsecond. But then other times it seems fairly innocuous when someone cuts plants or decelerates or tries to, propel themselves forward, and something happens. So I've always been of that. I've always had that fascination with why, because I've got a case study now that I'm thinking about since you asked of a player that I'm just working with at the moment in GB sevens. And firstly, I'm not going to say this is just my light bulb moment or down to me whatsoever, because it's never just about that, is it? But he's had a patellar tendinopathy for a long time. I'm saying years here, and he's tried the typical method. So he's used isometrics. They tend to piss it off, but all of the evidence will say that's a great way to load and remodel a tendon. Stress relaxation, a lot of the Keith Bar protocols and whatnot, but they really piss him off, his tendon off. So he does isometric isotonic movements, but he's got so little range of knee flexion under load. They're virtually pointless because you've got to go so heavy on them for them to load the tendon. But that's provocative at the same time. So I'm thinking this is he's been doing this for 2 years. It's just not working. Like what's the where are we going with this? And then he was in this cycle of unloading and loading, and playing sevens, you have a lot of surface changes. It gets hot, it gets cold. You play in Perth, then you play in Vancouver indoors on 3G. It's snowing there, then you come home and it's war. Like it's very, very chaotic. So it's not a great sport for someone that's got a really niggly patellar tendinopathy. So we just started looking at his history, and he had a pretty nasty um, high ankle sprain on the other side of the body. And while it was resolved, it was weak as hell. That ankle had was giving him absolutely nothing. He couldn't really land on it, but it wasn't painful. It was just a really poorly functioning joint. And a lot of his mechanics were really, really off when you watched him sprint. I mean, you slowed things down, you looked at it from behind, looked at him from front, looked from the side. And when we did manage to get some jump profiling on him, you see that that thing was flat as a tack. That ankle was doing nothing if you looked at a maybe single leg 510 reactive strength index measurement. So then, well, what's going on here? I know for a fact that if that side of the body isn't yielding and absorbing force, the other side is going to have to do it
Hmm.
because you can't just slow down naturally. You're going to have to decelerate and slow down yourself. Sometimes you take kickoffs, you slow down, you cut. So we started looking at that ankle. We started making sure it was articulating as it could do. It was pronating, trying to develop some reactive qualities back, some neuromuscular control in all of the planes. And then suddenly, like his other side, his tendinopathy side started to go, like started to alleviate. We started to be able to load it. We started to single leg squat it. We kept on going for the ankle. We didn't do a lot of patella tendon loading. We basically did some blood flow restriction, doing some heavy drags. That was it. That was literally it. And as of yesterday, the guy was pumping out really heavy split squats in a range of motion. He says he's not done since he was. He said I can't remember the last time I did that. And that's just an example to me where, and it's a famous saying from Dan Paff, what else, where else? What was causing this issue that you need to get to the bottom of that's just not going to change just with isometrics loading the tendon in question?
I think it's a good example, isn't it, of with tendons of where we are solely focused too much of the time on the tissue and what the tendon's doing. And to be honest, we're good at that now. There's a lot of research that tells us how the tendon adapts to load and how we can change it.
Yeah.
And we're really good at jumping to conclusions around game minutes and external load and exposures
Yeah.
for the tendon, forgetting that the rest of the body went through the same exposure.
Yeah.
I think we don't look at the overload internally, if we want to call it that. So like the biomechanics, like you're saying, of like what's happened, why are they loading that tendon in the way that they are? And I think,
Totally. That was it. And I'm just
yeah,
thinking this is a system problem. Like a joint doesn't, you don't just um, dissect someone's joint, stick it on the table, piss it off and put it back on the body. Like the body created the issue somehow. What is driving that? And what do you need to do before you can put the icing on the cake with some of the methods now that we're very, very well versed in?
I think it's a hard one. I don't think actually it's not hard. I think it's one that we sometimes fail to package for the athletes as well because we load the tendon because the byproduct of strength training is the adaptation in the tendon that you get. But very often the side that's painful is stronger. So it's quite, and I think that just gets missed all the time, saying to the athlete, we're doing this potentially painful exercise because the byproduct is X, but actually they know it's their stronger side, it's painful, and then we keep giving them exercises, cueing them to create as much force as possible and get as strong as possible. And it probably doesn't always make a lot of sense if we don't pause and sort of preface it to then get the buy-in that it's okay to do that and it's not the strength we want, it's the load.
I can't tell you how many times I've seen that,
Yeah.
Andy. We with England Rugby, we had a winger who had the strongest hamstrings we would ever seen, and I include all the population from England for the last 10 years, 6 years at the Waratahs, the strongest peak forces. Not a dramatic asymmetry, but unilaterally, but the strongest hamstring was the one that kept popping. And I'm saying this happened more than once. This happened over 10 years, maybe like at least 6 times. It was the stronger of the two hamstrings. You can't get that freaking hamstring any stronger. It wasn't the problem. It was not the problem.
And is that a pattern you've seen a lot? I know that's quite a common example with hamstrings. Is that something you've seen frequently where the injured tissue is where someone's doubled down on the same structure all the time?
Yeah, yeah, because I really believe that without generalizing too much, that it was that the tissue was under stress because of a movement issue, not because it wasn't strong enough. Or maybe there was a joint restriction that scuppered good leverages and good length tension relationships and meant the force was down, but it wasn't because this tissue couldn't tolerate strain. It was overloaded because other things weren't doing their job. And I'd have a list as long as my arm about these things. And this is why sometimes I have a little sinister little sort of anticipation when someone gets a minor injury. Because I think, right, this has been happening for a little while. He's been surviving. What can we do about this to eradicate it? I then get really dogmatic about just erasing this permanently, as
Yeah.
opposed to getting in the cycle of just managing things. I had that as a player, and it would drive me mad because you can't concentrate on your game.
I'd love to hear your take on this. I was in the gym myself this morning and I was listening to Alan Murdoch's recent episode with Stu, and they
Yeah,
were in, and I know you went on Alan's podcast earlier, or recently at least, and they were talking about when you look at movement and the athlete is sort of like deviations from the norm in some way. Their movement signature or whatever you want to call it is just slightly outside of what we deem normal.
yeah,
Obviously there's times when we see those cases and we know it's bad and we know it's not advantageous the way they move. But there's other times where an athlete just has a unique feature of how they move. Uh,
hmm
how do you sort of navigate, or what are your thoughts on identifying, is that something that we should correct or try and change versus is it something that actually helps them be special and we double down on it? How do you sort of navigate that, maybe that continuum?
yeah. It's a really good question, isn't it? Like, who is there anyone that tried to change Michael Johnson? There probably was.
Yeah, and that's the first athlete I
Yeah,
think of. Yeah.
I can think of it's one of my things where it's not a problem until it's a problem. And I again I keep on using anonymous case examples just so I just don't need anyone I don't want to talk about it unless they didn't want me to. But we've got a very explosive athlete with England Rugby for the last 10 years that runs a bit funky, and he would subvert a lot of the bandwidths for positive running. Very backside, lordotic, gut spilling out the front, very backside, kind of overreaches a little bit as a consequence. And it's one of those ones where you'd often get told, mate, this guy's fine. He's not had a soft tissue in ages. It's absolutely fine. Just leave him alone. You can only mess him about. Don't start putting things into his head. And like, yeah, I know, but um, until if everything's fine, isn't it? But then when he starts to get a bit neural down one side of his body, and he keeps on having to go to a third parties to get his back adjusted and his pelvis feels tight, he's not had a soft tissue. He's fine. He trains fully, but it's starting to become something. His pelvis is not stacked. He's not running in a way that over time I think his body's going to tolerate. It might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but I think the signs are, Andy, is that he's starting to get more treatment. He's probably in a bit more pain, a bit more grumbly. He's a bit more inconsistent with how high functioning he is. That's when I'd step in and go, look, we've got to just start just chipping away a bit more of a central approach here, as opposed to just letting him have a huge blowout and then it being a problem. And as it happens, in the last campaign with England, he got a pretty major soft tissue injury. And my first thought was, we haven't done something about this early enough. And it's hindsight, but we waited, and no one thought it was going to be important. Least of all me, I didn't. But then we did. And then when we had a chance to look at his movements, the way he was moving and some of his analytics, then you can go, yeah, there's some things here we can do now. But if we'd been a bit more thorough in our monitoring here, we might have been able to catch this. But sometimes with an athlete they're not going to buy until they get hurt. I had a guy at the Waratahs, a player, he was a Wallaby, had 1,000 hamstring injuries. It was only the thousandth one when before he wanted to change and listen to any of us about how he's managing his body. So sometimes you need that red flag before you can do anything about it, don't you? But I'd like to think you can step in when there's warning signs, red flags like pain, more treatment, inconsistent performances, niggles.
Yeah, I really appreciate your kind of pickup on the subtle signs because I think by the time the more obvious things present themselves in that first case, it's probably getting too late and you've missed the subtlety. So it's
Yeah,
quite your sort of idea around, you know, things aren't going as well as they used to. There's a greater frequency of treatments.
yeah.
I
You
think
can
that's a really meaningful thing.
Yeah, you see him on the field, he's stretching more than he used to. He gets more treatment on his lower back. He's going to people for help. Like, this he's not this, it's starting to creep that way. They're just
Yeah,
like little signs.
it's a really hard one, isn't it? Because if you leave that athlete alone and it works, you're a genius. But if you do nothing, but there was deviations of movement and things that somebody could point at and say, well, that wasn't right for a long time. and you did nothing, then you're negligent. So it's quite a hard. It's a very thin tightrope, isn't it, to walk on that
Yeah,
one.
totally. Yeah. And you don't want to scare someone. They come into international campaign and you say, well, there could be an issue here. Well, they don't want to hear that. They just want to feel great for the game. So you got to your timing's everything as well.
Obviously, like you all get good windows of seeing players when they're in for camps and tournaments. How much input can you then have afterwards? So you know maybe the athlete comes through the door and they survive the tournament, play well, physically hold up. How much time and how do you then after that block of time then have maybe a bit more input, a bit more strategy into working on those things?
Well, that tended to be down with the relationships you have with the clubs, and they were all unique. There's a
Yeah.
new collective agreement between club and country now with England and the Premiership clubs where they've signed an agreement which gives England a bit more control now. But back then we didn't really have any control. The players were paid and run by the private enterprises, which were the clubs, and England paid the players to play for England. But there was no direct control that you could have over them, really.
It's been a while since I've worked in rugby. I've been in the States for a good 7, 8 years now, and I think when I last worked with rugby players in the UK, mass was a big topic for
Yeah,
aerobic conditioning.
yeah,
Um, and I think it was on Alan's podcast. I heard you say that when the players got to you, you wanted to kind of provide them with a like almost like a premium experience. Like they needed to come in and receive the best experience for the week or two or whatever it was with you. How do you sort of go around individualizing player preparation, maybe from a conditioning perspective? Because I'm aware, mass seemed like the solution to everything,
yeah.
um, going back 8 to 10 years, but I'm sure it's probably not now.
No, I made that mistake. I did a pre-season with England where we got overly obsessed with the yo-yo score that was never going to give us what we thought it was going to give us, and we just hammered the lads with MAS and mass, and it didn't give us a payday. So I'd say now I don't think I haven't used MAS running for a long, long time. Certainly, they're not the last two World Cup camps. I haven't used them at all. I use them at the moment with England, with Great Britain Sevens because it's such a metabolic sport. There's probably merit in using a bit of that stuff because of some of those qualities need to be bumped up. But it's not a dominant part of the program. It's a part of a periodized program, whereas perhaps in the past it was just the go-to all year round for conditioning, foolishly. I These days I'm influenced by Gareth Stamford's sort of hybrid endurance fast profiling with regards to, looking at the anaerobic speed reserve, top speed and MAS, and which means you need to know what the MAS is, but you can also do it through, I think looking at critical speed analysis. And I I've got over the years just built up kind of a menu list really for what I call Clydesdale and thoroughbreds. And
Okay.
that's a term come from Stuart McMillan, where the thoroughbreds are kind of those fast twitchy guys, the fast template guys that probably need a bit more high intensity, more favorable work to rest periods, and you can build up their aerobic capacity through being a bit more that way. And they like their repeat speed efforts, they like their short intense intervals, and you can build a aerobic capacity that way. Whereas the Clydesdales are a bit more like your grinders, you guys that like the more continuous work that don't mind a lactic acid bath every now and again. So I've now got menus for both of those things and my own ways of trying to mailbox which one's which. And I do my best to individualize that as best as I can. And sometimes I make it too complicated, but it really often is what type of conditioning do you like doing? And the player will tell you, I like really snappy fast stuff, or I don't mind long runs. Sometimes that's all you need to ask them, and their intuition tells you really.
Is that a kind of common approach across, say, maybe like the Premiership or not? And the reason I ask is I started my career at Bristol Rugby as an intern, aged 19, the year they went down into the Championship for the first time, and or got stuck the first year of them being stuck in it for a while.
Yeah.
And the RFU anaerobic test was the big thing at the time, and I think every team was probably using that, and every team knew what Johnny Wilkinson's score was
Yeah,
at the
I did.
time. Is sort of conditioning a fairly consistent approach across the league, and most teams do it in a similar way. Um, is
Um,
there a lot of variance in approach?
no, I'd still say that MES is quite popular.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd still suggest that, and there's a lot of guys that you know, integrate a lot of different methods for create sort of game simulations, like with prowlers and contact conditioning and shuttles and things. I'd say it's all fairly glycolytic, and I'm generalizing here because I don't know what they just did in their last preseason. I wouldn't be able to say, but I'd say that I wouldn't say that there was anyone really going off piste too much. No,
Yeah.
I mean there's a big swing in the last couple of years for building work capacity through rugby and more tactical contexts than there used to be. There was always an focus on small-sided games, but they perhaps didn't have the tactical relevance. Whereas I think the tide's turned a little bit in the last 5 years, and I think Eddie Jones had something to do with this, with regards to developing tactical games that have got a physical, technical, tactical, even a psychological overload to them, where you're hitting more than one, you're hitting more than one bird with one stone there.
Obviously, like when you kind of group players from a conditioning perspective into sort of like thoroughbreds and Clydesdales, as you said,
Mm.
um, are you in that way doubling down on their strengths? We were talking about sort of like movement in a different way earlier about
Mm.
how that's complex. If you do that with conditioning, is there a certain amount of going against the grain that you think you need to do with them as well, where then you might recognize they're suited to a certain style of conditioning? How do you decide how much of what they're not maybe suited to you expose them to as a stimulus?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think everyone in certainly in sevens needs a bigger aerobic capacity. And everyone needs repeat sprint ability. And everyone needs to repeatedly accelerate and decelerate. So I think it's about leveraging the tools that are going to give you the biggest payday, biggest bang for their buck, without neglecting any particular capacity, because you kind of need everything. Rugby's extremely demanding in what it needs of someone. You've got to be, have endurance, speed, enduring speed, agility, evasion, the ability to multitask with decision making and skill execution. There's not an awful lot you can't be good at, you shouldn't be good at.
Hmm.
So while there's an argument for doing the things that they're not good at, I think you're covering it, trying to cover everything. You're just doing it in a format that's going to be digestible to them and that's going to give you a better outcome, a quicker, more efficient outcome. So I don't think we're neglecting any particular ability or capacity. We're just doing it in a way that's going to give you a better yield.
Yeah, so kind of like the environment gives them the baseline they need, and then your job is to sort of bring out super strengths, whether
Yeah,
that's in the gym or whether that's conditioning or
you've got to do it quickly because you might have to go in sevens. You've got to train hard the next day because you
yeah.
can't start to train slow and playing 7-on-7 in a big field. And if you crush them, if you're crushing some thoroughbred with some long distance stuff and they are a sack of shit the next day, you can't get anything from them. And it was like that, even like that with in my last job with England. Like if we had a thoroughbred on the wing and you belted him with a load of glycolytic work on a watt bike, you're really going to limit what he can do for you in after lunch. And then you're losing his performance on the field, and then it's lose lose. So if you give him some short intervals and he can really go hard on it and he recovers well from it because that's his genetic disposition to be able to do that, then you win because you're still pushing the envelope on what you need him to be good at in that way, but you can still get him out on the field.
Obviously, it's only kind of like one variable, but does rugby currently or sevens have minimum standards that teams want in a conditioning metric? And then the reason I ask that is kind of like that old school RFU anaerobic test kind of did, didn't it? It was kind of like, look, this is what international looks like, this is what Prem looks like. You sort of had the banding at the time.
Yeah, I'd say everyone's not everyone. I think a lot of people have an eye on the Bronco is because they know what people elite standards are.
Yeah.
It's helpful when you know what the very, very fit people can do on that because it gives you a target. I'm personally not a fan of the Bronco. I don't do it, but I kind of understand why people do it. So and I wouldn't criticize anyone for doing it. It's just not my. I don't think it's a true gives you a true assessment of MAS personally, and that's what I would do that test for, so you can program off of it,
Yeah.
as well as being an aerobic capacity marker. But then again, if you're turning that many times, I'm not sure if you're getting a true reflection of aerobic, aerobic speed.
I think
So
as well with those kind of like start stop tests as well, there's such a mental component to
yeah,
each change of direction is a mental test as the tests progress.
Well, the same with the intermittent yo-yo. You've got to. I God, I told you about that time when we overcooked the MAS. We had guys that we just pounded them with the MAS. We went back to do the yo-yo and they stayed the same. It was the turning technique was the issue. It wasn't their physiology. They couldn't turn fast enough. These were props. It's the same like in the Bronco. It's a lot of turns. It's a lot of turns. So if you're doing a lot of that many things, does the test that, or does it test what you're hoping it's testing you? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a good Eric Mirror physio quote of the test tests what the test tests, which I just think is good in S&C and in conditioning capacity as well.
The
But
test tests what the test tests. Yeah.
um, it must be quite different. I know you've spent some time in the States with other sports as well. Um, was there anything done conditioning there? Because obviously the States is very public for the combine in any sport, but particularly in football, and they've
Mm.
sort of like the analytics and the data they can compare and contrast across players for different agility and speed tests is quite prolific. Rugby's quite different to that. Has that shaped any sort of philosophies for you having been there?
Well, the facilities I worked at, I thought they were quite innovative with their conditioning. They're very scientific. They're very scientific with it. So they did a lot of like repeat agility circuits and things like that, which were really high intensity and um, in almost like in cluster formats, like they're performing multiple downs. I thought that was quite smart. I could say that some of the colleges that I visited and saw, they just drilled guys with gases and pitch width shuttles and things that were just like soul destroyingly brutal. And and again, I hope I'm not talking out of hand. There is that a culture in some sports over there which is like, I'm gonna break you. And it's like that in rugby as well sometimes. I'm not saying that's not exclusive to America. I saw a bit of that, but that doesn't mean they all do that. Like some people sort of go down the feed the cats approach, the Tony Holler philosophy of speed first, which is kind of my bias, I admit. Um, and I don't know. I mean, it would be hard to say. Recently, I wouldn't really know, quite frankly.
Yeah. And we've spoken a lot today about kind of rugby specifically and sevens and international. What does sort of like your typical work or week look like at the moment? What sort of athletes problems are you solving currently with a change of careers?
Well, at the moment, it's trying to train 7v7 in a context that's going to be tactically and physically relevant in really cold, wet conditions in Southwest London when we're going to be playing indoors in a covered Vancouver Stadium in 10 days' time. So apart from the environmental challenges, it's because it's a fitness sport. It's really difficult to train sevens without putting pressure on someone's conditioning. Because, like I said, the time and space that you need to replicate the game is very stressful. Like, there's only so many walkthroughs you can do with 7-on-7. You kind of need to operate at pace.
Yeah.
So managing people so that they can constantly get to the start line and operate at pace and do it as much as you need to when you're a camp-based model. We're not full-time, we're a camp-based model. So we've got to do it enough that we can try and catch up with all the other nations that are full-time. So that's a challenge because we need to maximize time on feet and we also need to make sure they're as fit as they can. So you're trying to serve two masters a little bit there and you're trying to play catch up in the same respect. And
Mm.
with that comes, when you're pushing the line that much, comes niggles. Like I mentioned before about the tendinopathies and you get a lot of sore lower backs because they're landing, taking kickoffs and sprinting, high speed runnings way higher than what I was used to with England. Decelerations are way, way higher, like double what I'm used to as well. So with that comes quite high, extreme degree of tendon loading.
Yeah.
So it's probably just a more extreme version of what I was used to, really.
Yeah. And are you enjoying the change? I know you've got like a consulting firm um, or something
Yeah,
that's online. Are you busy with that at the moment too, whilst you're doing the sevens work or?
that's a bit of a passive runner. Myself and Ollie Richardson, another S&C coach. We post tidbits on there, and there's some automated programs that come on the back of it. There's some bespoke individual programming options there as well for those that would like it. But I wouldn't say that's a big time filler. the sevens is quite time consuming because there's a lot of travel included.
Yeah, yeah,
Vancouver,
far
Perth,
afield as well.
and whatnot. So that's where all the time's taken up.
Very cool. Well, I'm aware of time, and I know I've kept you for a few more minutes than planned. But where
No,
can people?
I'm good if you need it. I'm good if you need more.
I was going to say, where can people find you, and where can people keep up to date with what you're doing, the programs themselves, and
I'm
find you?
probably most active on Instagram, and that's just Tom Tombleson, my name. And then I've also got this another page with Ollie called TTOR Performance Tour Performance, and that's where there's a bit more S&C related content and access to some of the online programming resources.
Cool. I'll find the links for those, and I'll put those in the show notes, people, and then anyone listening can find them as well. So, but it's been really good to talk to you. I listened to you recently on Dan Cole on his show, and I think they got to ask you all the questions that I shouldn't, but would want to ask you about who benches the most, who squats the most. So, luckily, finding that got that out of my system before I tried to have a sensible conversation with you today, mate. So.
They were the questions I would have asked as well.
So, but mate, thank you for your time. It's really good to connect as well. So, thanks for coming on.